If you just want to say, look, I'm a rationalist. I want to make my decisions based on the most objectively, logically consistent argument. You will be forever confounded about what decision to make. Because there are more than one logically consistent arguments that make sense, and that if you follow them all the way down, you could convince yourself that's absolutely the right thing to do. So how are we as humanity meant to make that decision?
This is the Dilemmas on Screen, a Jewish perspective podcast, where we take ambiguous moral situations in fictional popular movies and TV shows and analyze them from a Torah lens. As a quick overview, the Avengers are a series of movies about a team of superheroes that defend humanity from those who intend to inflict harm on the human race. Avengers Infinity War, which was released in 2018, introduces Thanos as the main antagonist. Thanos is a powerful being seeking to collect all 6 Infinity Stones. Once combined, the stones give him incredible power. Thanos' stated goal is to wipe out half of all living beings in the universe to restore balance. His motivation stems from his home planet, Titan, which collapsed due to overpopulation and resource exhaustion. Thanos claims his plan is merciful and random, sparing future generations from suffering and starvation. The Avengers, of course, unite in their attempts to stop Thanos from wiping out half of all living beings across the entire universe. What makes Thanos so compelling as a villain is that he is not doing this for evil reasons. His motivations are to help people, to do good for others. As we noted, Thanos recounts Titan's downfall and frames his plan as an act of mercy. He claims the universe's resources are finite and overpopulation will cause universal extinction. He insists the solution must be random, impartial, and absolute. There's no favoring the elite, or the rich, or the powerful. Everyone is fair game. Thanos even goes so far as to put his own skin in the game. He learns that to obtain one of the 6 Infinity Stones, he must sacrifice someone he loves. Despite shedding tears, he kills his daughter Gamora, and in doing so shows the depth of his conviction. The film frames this as both tragedy and proof that he believes in his cause. After acquiring all 6 stones, and even being dealt what well could be a death blow by Thor, Thanos snaps his fingers, erasing half of all life. He then retreats to a quiet planet to watch the sunrise, seemingly at peace. He even destroys the Infinity Stones, giving up the extraordinary power they bestow because he does not want his decision to be reversed. Here are a few questions we'd like answered. In Torah thinking, how do we approach Thanos' decision? Specifically, are we allowed to kill some people to save others? More broadly, do we believe that the ends justify the means? If the means are evil, but the result is good, what's the Jewish perspective? Another question. Thanos clearly believes in what he was doing. He was willing to sacrifice his daughter, whom he loved. He wasn't some evil madman cackling as he went along, ruining everyone's lives out of spite. He did what he thought was necessary to help humanity. Does that mitigate the evil of his actions? Speaking of mitigating circumstances, he destroyed the Infinity Stones after he accomplished his mission. There's a saying, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. What does that say about his intentions if he clearly was not corrupted? He did what he did purely for the sake of what he thought was correct. Once he accomplished that, he just gave up the power. How do we approach that? And then lastly, speaking of these two mitigating circumstances, is Thanos more dangerous because he genuinely believes that he's right? That in a way is scarier than an evil person knowing that he's evil. Here, Thanos genuinely believes that he believes in what he's doing. Does this make it more terrifying and worthy of condemnation, or does this mitigate his evil? Does this make him more sympathetic? Does it make him a better person? Is it more comforting and less scary, the fact that he thinks he's doing what's right? I am excited to bring back Rabbi Moshe Friedman on the podcast. Rabbi Friedman formally joined us for our first episode released on Harry Potter and whether Harry owes a debt of gratitude to the Dursleys despite their mistreatment of him. Rabbi Friedman is a Jewish educator, musician, spoken word artist, video essayist, and author. He has spoken and performed for audiences around the world and continues to explore innovative ways of spreading Jewish wisdom through art, music, and media. You can find his work at ravmo.com and on his YouTube channel, Mensch Sense. I'll include all the links below. Also, if you enjoy this podcast, please leave us a review and share with your friends. We also welcome comments and reviews with suggestions for future episode ideas as we continue to dissect moral dilemmas in the biggest movies and TV shows out there, all from a Jewish perspective. Thank you and enjoy the show. All right. So Rabbi Friedman, thank you so much for joining us again on the podcast.
It's so good to be back. Thank you, Ophir, for inviting me.
Yeah, absolutely. How can I not? That was a great episode, and it was the first one you released. So 2 thumbs up.
I just hope that we can follow up with something as good.
I think so. I think the Avengers is definitely, this is a question I've seen suggested to me multiple times. When you recommended it, I was like, yep, that's a go. All right. So I guess instead of starting more generally, I want to ask more specifically, because Thanos, what does he do? He's like, look, we'll kill some people to make the lives of other people better. So just starting with that specific question, does the Torah ever allow for the situation where you could kill some people to save other people? Is that specific scenario permitted? And then we can get into the broader questions of, do the ends justify the means? But let's start with that.
Yeah. So knowing full well that we are jumping into the literal deep end of philosophy, right? This is one of the, if not the most famous question ever asked, is can you measure the well-being of some at the expense of the other? Can you measure, happiness in general and say, well, this percentage of happiness is going to be smaller than that amount of happiness? Is this even quantifiable? And are we allowed to act on it, even if it is quantifiable? So Thanos does something which I think makes him a very effective villain, first of all. In terms of bad guys, Thanos is a really good bad guy. And what I mean by good is not like he's good, but I mean he's a really compelling bad guy. And that's important. You need to be able to empathize just a little bit with the villain to say, wait a minute, is he right? Did he do what he was? Maybe I agree with. No, I don't. But maybe he's a point, So there's something really amazing about the Thanos character. And what he's essentially doing is he's saying, I care so much about humanity or sentient beings, right? Because it's the Marvel universe and there's aliens, but all sentient beings. And I think there's been some discussion about, does he kill half the lizards and half the chickens and half the, right? Even like the lower life of animals, or half the cows gone too? Or is it just the kind of anyone who's a sentient, self-aware being? But he essentially wants to, yeah, go ahead.
Yes, sorry, just to build off that is something funny. As I was reading up discussions, I'd like to see, how do people approach this issue? So a lot of people are like, well, he kind of shot himself in the foot. It's true. Maybe you killed half of humanity or sentient beings, but if you're also killing half of the resources, like all the cows and the chickens, and that doesn't help. But yeah, I have seen that discussion.
Maybe he thought we should be vegetarians too. I don't know. Maybe we'll just throw in lots more altruistic motivations. But what he's essentially saying is, I care so much about sentient life in the universe that it hurts me too much to see the overall suffering caused by overpopulation. And therefore, in order to spare everyone who's alive, I have to just lop off half the population.
Part of his motivation here is based on his own personal experience, like on his own home planet with Titan. Right. That's exactly what happened. He warned them. He's like, guys, like, this is not going well. We need to slash the population in half. No discrimination, not like save the wealthy and kill the poor, or, harp on the weak. And then they didn't do it. They thought he was a madman, and then Titan got destroyed. And so he's kind of saying, like, this is literally what happened to us. So I'm now sparing the universe from our fate.
Yeah.
Which makes him even more compelling.
Yeah. But look, first of all, there are so many problems I have just with the mechanics of this thing. Like, before we get into the philosophical question, this whole question of overpopulation. Okay, number one, isn't the universe infinite? So if we're talking about a universe of people who have colonized lots of planets and galaxies, why couldn't he just snap half of them to new planets so that they could live in unpopulated places? I mean, there's so many. Also, I mean, there's lots of other issues as well. The other issue is that one that people who speak about demographic collapse currently are talking about, right? Because right now, most Western countries are having the opposite problem, is that there's underpopulation. People are not reproducing enough. And many people think, oh, that's great, the housing prices will go down. But what it really means is financial collapse, because if you just exponentially reduce the number of taxpayers and people who are productively contributing to the labor market, so you're just going to have a bottoming out of all the people who are supporting all the elderly and all the people who need welfare, and so it's a very overly simplistic calculation to say that simply killing half the population is actually going to make life better. It would probably, in a realistic scenario, it would probably cause crazy economic catastrophes around the universe. But let's say, for argument's sake, that Thanos was right and that somehow killing half the population was going to be good for everyone else. Do we see such a complement, something similar in the Torah? So before we get into, are you, in broader questions of are you allowed to make certain calculations like this to sacrifice the few to save the many or whatever it is, we do see limited situations where we say that it's worthwhile sacrificing some to make the lives of others better. The most notable example of this is the military. We have a military, and we say that it's worth it for a group of people to put their lives at risk in order to make the rest of the population better off. Now, is that not it's not exactly the same, because first of all, there's some level of voluntary. Okay, that's maybe debatable, but at least there's something altruistic and noble about going into battle, number one. And number two, you're not automatically guaranteed to die, everybody who goes into the military. But what we're saying is that it's worthwhile for a group of people to put their lives in great risk and danger in order to preserve the livelihood of many, many other people. So that would be one example. Do you have any questions on that? Do you agree with me, disagree with me that that's a valid comparison?
So I guess I never thought of that. That is an interesting example. I actually think that's a good starting point. I don't think it's the same I think it's a good example for a couple of reasons. First, it's exactly the issue in terms of we're effectively saying these people are going to need to die, or would potentially get killed, put their lives at risk to save the people back home. That's the issue. Now, the military is a bit different because, again, first, there's no guarantee that you're dying. It's not like, someone's just snapping their fingers and killing you, volunteering your life to save themselves. But what I do think is powerful is that sometimes you almost are guaranteed to die. I can't remember all the examples, but I'm positive that there are some where a general will take a battalion or whatnot and effectively say, these people are a bit of a sacrificial lamb because we need to divert the attention of the enemy. So we're sending them to die because there's a larger war that needs to be won.
D-Day, we're going to lose half of our men at least, right? Just being able to storm the beach.
And also, I think Churchill, I saw that movie with Churchill with Gary Oldman a few years ago, where apparently Churchill knew that there was 30,000, I can't remember the exact numbers, it was tens of thousands of men in some random kind of bunker in Normandy. And they're like, your job is to distract the Germans as much as you possibly can, just bomb them. But they're like, it's a suicide mission. He's like, yeah, it is a suicide mission because we need to get the hundreds of thousands of soldiers that we have on the beaches back home. That's literally what he did. He's like, it was a hard decision, and we're going to get to that soon. It was a hard decision, and it needs to be made. You need to sacrifice some tens of thousands to save the hundreds of thousands. That's actually, I think the more I think about it, the better the example it is. That's exactly right. Now, again, I think the military is different, but you'd have to start going into the weeds to figure out why.
Sure. So that's one of the major examples that comes out. Now, this whole question has echoes of one of the famous philosophical questions that many, many people are aware of, even if you've never studied philosophy, and that's what's called the trolley experiment. And the trolley experiment being a trolley, I guess they say it's in San Francisco because the trolleys are going downhill, and the brakes are out, and you're going to, the guy who's the conductor, what do you call a trolley driver, realizes that if he doesn't do anything, he will crash into 5 innocent bystanders. But if he pulls the lever, which changes the track, he will only end up killing 3. And you can play around with the numbers here or whatever. But essentially, he's saying, I'm willing to take an action to sacrifice some people in order to preserve other people. Now, what calculation?
And more
Yeah.
people. And more people.
And more people. So exactly. The calculation in that case is quantitative. So I'm saving 5 at the expense of 3, but you can always tweak this scenario and say, well, actually, the guy, if I did nothing, there's only one guy on the track, but he is a cancer researcher who's got groundbreaking new evidence for how to save, millions of people. And if I do pull the track, I'm going to be running over a serial murderer. So you can do it 1-to-1 and simply say that the guy at the bottom's life is more valuable than the murderer, right? So many of these examples have been chosen, and if people want a really good, quick run through of this, I highly recommend Michael Sandel's. He recorded a series of Harvard lectures of Ethics 101, which are available for everybody to watch, and it's brilliant in how easy and accessible he makes this material. But he shows you all the interesting logical fallacies and how difficult it is, because the people who do say, yeah, you should kill the 1 to save the 3, he then says, okay, let's imagine a new scenario. You're standing on a bridge over the trolley and you see a really obese man who's leaning over, and all you have to do is push him off in front of the trolley, and then you'll stop the trolley from killing 3 people. Isn't that the same thing as moving the lever over to kill 1 person instead of 3? And now most people say they would not kill the fat man, as opposed to most people saying that they would pull the lever. So it's a very complicated question. But what it really comes down to, Ophir, is, am I allowed to make these measurements? Am I allowed to weigh the value of lives, the quantity of lives? Am I allowed to do something like that? And just in order to round out the picture, let's get what the alternative perspective would be. The alternative perspective is what's known as deontology, or Kant was really somebody who was a big proponent of this alternative. And he said, I don't care what the outcome is. You're not allowed to make decisions based on the results. The only thing you're allowed to make a decision on is the morality of the deed itself. The deed itself is what matters, and I'm almost blind to the outcome. So for Kant, he would say, you're never allowed. It wasn't your fault that the trolley was barreling down the hill in the first place. So the 3 people who get killed on the bottom are not going to be on your conscience. But if you move that lever, then you've made an active decision to kill a person, and that will be on your conscience. So you have this setup where what's called the utilitarians will say, I'm going to figure out I'm just going to maximize for numbers of lives or quality of life, right? That would be Thanos. And the deontologists, maybe that's Marvel superheroes, I don't know, would say, but the action itself is wrong. I don't care what the results are. The act of murder is still murder, no matter what it amounts to. And this is the great setup that is presented here. Now, for those who are thinking, yeah, well, I'm really on the side of the Kantians, the deontologists here. I agree. The act of murder is wrong. So there are people who have poked holes in this theory as well. And they say, well, let's take this to its logical extreme. Which things are morally reprehensible such that you can never do them? So Kant says murder, theft, lying. Okay, well, what happens if you're a nice, rebellious German citizen in the time of the Third Reich who disagrees fundamentally with the Nazi regime, and you've got a little Jewish person hiding in your house, and all of a sudden you get a knock on the door from the SS officer and say, excuse me, Herr Heisenberg, are there any Jews in your house? Well, if lying is morally reprehensible, then under no circumstances are you ever allowed to lie, even if it's going to result in the saving of a life. So I think a lot of people are uncomfortable with that grotesque conclusion of the extreme version of Kantianism, to say that we only look at the deed and we never look at the action. So it's a real face-off here between ends justify the means versus the means are so sacred that we never question them. So this is really what we're asking here. This is really what we're asking.
Now I know what you mean by it. This is kind of like the basics of philosophy, the kind of the biggest question there is.
Yes, in terms of ethics, yes. This is really the heart of it. This is getting to the heart of it. So now we have to ask, well, what does the Torah say?
Right.
What does the Torah say?
We got Kant. We got, I guess, utilitarianism, which is Thanos. So yeah, what does the Torah say? Which side? Like, where do we lean towards?
So I'd like to give you the kind of classic answer, and then I want to give you a slightly more controversial answer, if that's okay with you.
Please
so the
do.
Classic answer, there's a Gemara in the Yerushalmi, in I believe Timura, that speaks about a case of these roving marauders who come upon a Jewish community.
So, yeah,
yes.
I'm sorry, just for our listeners, you quoted the Yerushalmi. Do you mind just giving some background? Like, what is the Yerushalmi?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I apologize. It is I'm referring to the Jerusalem Talmud. So most Jews spend most of their time studying the Babylonian Talmud, which really was the Talmud that was accepted. That was the set of oral debates and traditions that were passed down from the rabbis of roughly the 1st century to the 5th century, but concurrently there was still a small group of Jews still living in the land of Israel at the time after the Roman exile, and they compiled what's called the Jerusalem Talmud. And it does carry some legal weight, but in most cases we mostly refer to the Babylonian Talmud. Now it happens to be that the Babylonian Talmud is somewhat silent on this matter, although we will come back to the Babylonian Talmud. The Jerusalem Talmud gives a pretty interesting example, which is close to what we've been discussing, which is you've got this nice little Jewish community, and all of a sudden these roving barbarians come knocking on your door and say, listen, we're going to kill every last one of you unless you give up one person. You choose one person as a sacrifice, and we'll leave the rest of you alone. Otherwise, we'll kill everyone. So in that case, it's quite clear. The rabbis said, under no circumstances are you allowed to choose that one person. And it sounds as if they are coming down hard on the side of Kantianism to say, I'm sorry, but you selecting a person versus everyone else is basically choosing somebody to die. And you can't single out a single person for murder, even if it means that the alternative is that everyone's going to get killed. So it's a pretty strong condemnation of utilitarianism to say, well, let's sacrifice the few to save the many. And all the more so, Thanos' idea of let's sacrifice half to save the other half. However, they give go ahead.
So I guess a follow-up question, and you may be getting into this, but does the Jerusalem Talmud explain why, or they just say, the rabbi said absolutely not? Is there an explanation for what their reasoning is?
Yes. So I think that if we delve a little bit more deeply into the reason for this, we'll come up with something interesting. Now jumping back to the Babylonian Talmud, there is another famous case where somebody holds a gun to your head. It's not a gun because they didn't have guns 2,000 years ago. They hold a knife to your throat and say, if you, Ophir, don't kill Jacob, who's standing next to you, innocent guy, then I'll kill you. So, Ophir, you are not allowed to kill Jacob in order to save your own life. Okay? Now, not only that, but the legal experts discuss, well, let's play around with, how, like in the case of the trolley experiment, we played around with who's being selected here. Is it the cancer researcher or the serial murderer? The Torah says even somebody who's not a nice person, who's a wicked person, and you, Ophir, are the most saintly, holy guy on the planet, you still can't kill him. And the language of the Talmud is, who says your blood is redder than his? Who says your blood is redder? So now this becomes a very complicated issue, and there's a lot of different explanations about when we say whose blood is redder. Is that saying because you're both the same, or is it saying we don't know whose blood is redder, and therefore in the case of uncertainty we just shouldn't act? But whatever, let's leave that aside for now. What seems to be the case is, and this seems to go corroborate with a lot of what we know about the Torah, is that when it comes to human life, we cannot play these games about measuring, right? To say it's worthwhile to sacrifice this for the sake of that. When it comes to human life, it seems like we just simply can't do that. Okay?
Okay.
So if we were to pause right now, we'd say there's no way that we can ever do what Thanos did. No way.
Right. Especially since the Jerusalem Talmud says you can't even volunteer one person's life for an entire village. There's no, like you said, there's no way you're doing half.
That's right. Now, it does change a little bit. There seems to be a bit of it becomes more complicated. The Jerusalem Talmud makes it when they say the marauders come and they actually say, we're here for Jacob. So they come with a specific person in mind. So you're not choosing who the victim's going to be. They've already selected that person. In that case, there are opinions that say that you can give that person up. Especially if maybe they've done something wrong to offend these marauders. Maybe they're the ones who are responsible. So it becomes a little bit more complicated, but that's, I think, already a side issue. However, in order to make this more interesting, I did want to bring up a couple more cases that maybe bend the issue here, okay? Where I think there are a few cases within Torah literature where we are given a certain amount of latitude to make these calculations about measuring one good over another, to take a slightly more utilitarian approach. Well, in fact, there are many times where we have to make decisions about when we're presented with two mitzvahs that are in conflict with each other. Sometimes I have to make a decision about which one's more important, right?
Right.
So there's a great example that I remember a rabbi of mine was telling me after my first year in yeshiva. I was with a bunch of guys who did not grow up religious. And he was speaking to us about what happens when you go home. And he says there will inevitably be some of you for whom the issue of keeping kosher is going to be a major wedge between you and your parents, right? What? You're now rejecting my cooking. You don't like what I make for you. It's not good enough for you, right? So, I mean, that it happens. It happens a lot. And I can understand that. It's, we're the ones who changed, like not them. So this rabbi said, you need to know that there's a Torah mitzvah of honoring your mother and father, but there's also a Torah mitzvah of keeping kosher. However, unbeknownst to some people, a lot of the mitzvahs of keeping kosher, a lot of the laws surrounding kashrut are not Torah-based, they're rabbinic. And we do have a general rule within Jewish law, which is that if you're presented with a Torah-based mitzvah and one that is only rabbinic in origin, the Torah mitzvah takes precedence. So, for example, the idea that you need separate pots and pans for milk and meat is a rabbinic enactment. In truth, from a Torah perspective, if you use a pot to cook chicken soup and then you clean it out really well and you wait 24 hours, biblically speaking, you can use that pot for a milky pasta sauce. So now we can't on normal circumstances, you can't just say, oh, well, it's only rabbinic, so I'm not going to follow it. On all things being equal, you've got to follow the rabbinic prohibitions or the rabbinic laws as well. But when it conflicts with a Torah prohibition, let's say honoring your mother and father, so then, okay, you've got to make that calculation. And the rabbis say unequivocally that you have to follow the Torah prohibition. I want to bring a couple of other examples, which are a little bit more risky. One example, and this is going to be touchy for a lot of reasons. One example is going to be ransoming hostages. I don't know when you're going to be airing this, but as of the time of this recording, the hostages that were taken on October 7th, the remaining living hostages, were only released a week ago. So this is going to be let's speak purely theoretically at this point, okay? Because I think there's going to be a lot of emotions that are charged around this topic. But purely theoretically speaking, at a certain point, now let's start from the beginning. Getting hostages back, getting back a Jewish hostage is one of the most high priority mitzvahs that you could ever do. You can sell a Sefer Torah to get the money back to ransom a hostage. Getting back a hostage, you can sell almost anything. Okay, you can go to incredible lengths. Don't even ask me about breaking the Sabbath. Of course, you can break Shabbat to get a hostage back. You can do almost anything to get a hostage back. Okay. At a certain point in Jewish history, non-Jews started cottoning on to how important getting hostages back was to Jews. And they leveraged that, as they tend to do even in modern times. They know how much we value life. And so they started making it a policy of ransoming more people because they knew the exorbitant sum that the Jewish communities would be willing to pay to get their hostages back. And this caused the rabbis of the Talmud to sit back and say, hold on a second. If we are ransoming hostages and paying so much money, and as a result, it's causing more hostages to be taken because of all the money that's dangling in front of these potential hostage takers, then are we doing more harm than good by paying this much money for hostages? And now it almost becomes a utilitarian question. And they started to say that we're past a certain amount of money, which has to be decided what's a acceptable sum to pay for a hostage. Past a certain amount of money, you are not permitted to pay to get back a hostage. Taking into account how much we value human life, understanding full well how far we would go to get back a hostage, nonetheless, the rabbis of the Talmud said, we're making the calculation that this will, in the long run, end up costing us more hostages if we keep paying this much money for them. Now, that to me sounds like a utilitarian argument. No?
Yeah, it does.
So the question that I think we're left with here is, okay, so make up your mind. Are you Jews utilitarians or Kantians? Do you go with the act itself is sacrosanct? So now we're presented with the dilemma of which side does the Torah actually come down on? I think a lot of people would say that the Torah basically says the ends never justify the means. The act itself is always sacred. You can't say, well, I'll break Shabbat in order to make some more money so that I can feed the poor. We don't say that in general. But we have these instances, these cases, where every now and then you see an exception popping through where the authority was given to human beings to be able to decide a calculation. In the long run, even if I sacrifice something now, I'll end up getting more later. And that seems to throw a throw a spanner in the works, they say in England, to throw a monkey wrench in the system of our theory that everything is simply Kantian when it comes to the Torah. What are your thoughts?
Before I get my thoughts, so just to clarify, because I'm thinking the two examples you gave was that in the Jerusalem Talmud, it says, when a bunch of marauding barbarians came to a town and said, we'll either kill all of you or just give us one person and the rest of you will be spared, the rabbis were like, absolutely not. Things change if the barbarians say, we want Jacob, like this guy, then it's a bit easier to give up. But the point is, we can't decide and say, we're going to volunteer this guy, even if everyone dies. We have to allow ourselves to get killed. However, so in terms of which
was also, by the way, this became a real life situation in the ghettos in Eastern Europe during World War II, where the SS guards go to the Jewish head of the camp and say, we need a selection. You need to actually round up this number of people and send them off to their death. And the Jewish person says, am I allowed to do that? Am I allowed to sacrifice some at the expense of letting everyone else live for at least a little bit longer? So these were real life situations that were happening.
Yes.
And so they're not just theoretical. But yes, that's essentially what you were saying, is that the Torah pretty much comes down and says you're really not allowed to do that.
Right. And like, so what that seems to be saying is that one person's life, you effectively have to sacrifice everybody for it. However, interesting when it comes to the hostages, where you'd say there's one person's life whose life is at risk. And so you think, okay, well, we need to do whatever we can to get them back. And the rabbis say, no, you don't. Actually, you are not allowed to whatever pay X amount of money, which is amazing, because effectively what they're saying is, one situation is you have to let the whole village die instead of giving up that one person. Whereas here, you have one person who you could just pay money for. And the answer is no, because that might risk other people later on. I see the issue.
I'm reminded of another case where this is similar, where we're also being asked to make calculations. Now, you know how I said you're not allowed to break Shabbat in order to go make money to feed the poor. We know that, right? However, when the Talmud discusses what exactly is the reason why we're allowed to break Shabbat to save a life, why are we allowed to break Shabbat to save a life? So there are actually numerous rationales given by the Talmud, by different opinions about why you're allowed to. Now get this, one of the rationales given is because it's better to break one Sabbath so that the person who's being saved can keep many more Sabbaths. Now that to me sounds like a utilitarian argument, doesn't it? It's worthwhile for us to profane one Sabbath so that we can keep somebody alive so that they can keep lots more Sabbaths, lots more Shabbats. Okay? So, I mean, what are you talking about here? I thought the ends don't justify the means.
Right.
So,
I've never thought of that before.
We have this chink in the armor here in terms of our Kantian theory of the Torah. So this is where I'd like to pivot and suggest a novel idea. And this novel idea is that I have a theory, and the buck stops at me because I haven't seen anybody else say it explicitly. But I have a theory that, in fact, the Torah sees all of morality as utilitarian. The Torah sees all of morality as a calculation. What's going to produce the ultimate good? What's going to produce the ultimate good? Now, there's a problem with that, which is a major critique that has been leveled in philosophical circles against the utilitarians, and I think it is probably the strongest argument against utilitarianism. The argument is, what makes you think that you know what's going to produce the ultimate good? You don't know the future. You don't know all of the variables. So how do you think that you can even make a calculation like that? You don't have what the economists call perfect information. You think that you're going to snap your fingers and the life is going to be better for the other half. What if life is horrific for the other half? Exactly as I was saying at the beginning of this episode, what happens if you're like, oh, I didn't take into account economic collapse and the fact that half the people are in absolute mourning for their loved ones who they'll never see again, and now life is miserable for everybody. So maybe you never saw that coming. That's a perfect example of why, even if morality is in some sense utilitarian, as human beings, we're not really allowed to make that decision except in very rare circumstances where we have been given that authority. Ultimately, there's only one perspective that has perfect information. You know who that is?
God.
G-O-D. It's God. God is the only one who knows what's going to happen when he does X. right? And he can see to the end of the universe and the end of time and say, yeah, this is ultimately going to be for the good, which, by the way, is one of the, as an offshoot, this may be one of the answers as to why is it that God is able to allow tragic things to happen. To say, well, hold on a second, God, why aren't you being held to the same standard that we're being held to? We're not allowed to murder people in order to affect a better outcome. So why are you? And the answer is, well, I mean, there's a lot of answers to that. But one potential way of understanding this is God is the only being who has perfect information such that he knows with absolute certainty that the smaller tragedy can happen today so that the larger tragedy is averted tomorrow, or so that a greater good can be achieved tomorrow. And therefore, we can say that although morality as a whole is utilitarian and God is actually able to make these calculations, we as human beings are not entrusted in most cases to make that decision because we simply do not have enough information.
The way I understand it then, I mean, it seems pretty clear then that we would not. So first, what Thanos did was definitely incorrect, right? That would not be permitted. Is that correct?
Yes, but incorrect for maybe not for the reasons that we started with.
Interesting. So do you mind just clarifying that?
What I mean is that if you could imagine that Thanos was God, maybe he could. Maybe he could do that. What I'm suggesting is that it's not like a blanket rule. We're not Kantians in the sense that we say that we ignore the consequences of our actions altogether. We don't care about it at all. All we do is focus on the deed itself. What I'm suggesting is there's a practical reason why we have to be Kantians. It's not because we don't care about the ends. It's because we don't know the full extent of the consequences of our actions, and neither did Thanos. That's why he was wrong.
Interesting. That is interesting because that's easy to understand how we can see like the hostage case where, it's like, I'm assuming history proved it, was that if we keep paying these exorbitant fees to redeem our hostage, they're just going to take more, which is precisely what they did. However, when it comes to, still entirely clear on like, why is it that you can't volunteer one person's life to save an entire village? That's what I'm kind of having there. We apparently seem to say absolutely not. I mean, it's not that hard to figure out. You don't give that one person up, the whole village is going to die. Like, I'm not entirely sure what that issue is then. Like, this isn't like, is it going to be better if Thanos destroys half of life? Okay, you could see how that's a problem, but give you 1,000 people and if you just give one of them over, he's going to die anyway. Just give him up.
Yeah.
Sorry, do you mind clarifying that? That's why I'm
so I think this will be I think what would be helpful here is to kind of backtrack and say, okay, so hold on a second. Can you flesh out, Moshe, a little bit more why it is that we're not allowed to look at the ends in certain cases,
right?
But maybe we are in other cases. Yeah. So before, in order to do that, I just want to bring a little bit of evidence for my theory, because I just gave you a theory.
Right.
And my evidence is as follows, is that there is a discussion within Talmudic literature about what life was like before the giving of the Torah. Was there a proto-Torah that the patriarchs and matriarchs had to follow? So, according to the rabbis of the Talmud, the answer is yes, but not exactly the same type of binding obligation that we have post Mount Sinai. We have rabbinic sayings that say that Abraham kept the entire Torah, kept everything. He somehow divinely understood that you're supposed to put a black box on your arm and your head, and he walked around with like proto-tefillin. Now, what was written in those tefillin, I don't know, but that's kind of the idea. And he was eating kosher animals and whatever. However, we also know that there are certain cases where the patriarchs and matriarchs made exceptions to the rule. One of the most famous being that Jacob married two sisters. And the Torah says you're not allowed to marry two sisters. And there is a fascinating discussion, and I believe it's the Nefesh HaChaim, who says that before the giving of the Torah, the patriarchs and matriarchs were on such a high spiritual level that they were actually able to determine what the spiritual consequences of their actions would be. And if they saw fit to temporarily suspend one of the laws of the Torah in order to achieve a certain intended aim, they were allowed to do that. Now, to me, that sounds like a perfect proof that before the giving of the Torah, morality was a lot more utilitarian from a spiritual point of view. It was only a certain point in history where God decided that for whatever reason, which I think is maybe beyond the scope of this podcast, for whatever reason, we need to change it. Maybe it's because that was that's the startup. But now we've moved on to like a major 2,000 person company, and you now need an HR department, and you now need uniform rules for everybody. And you can't just have everyone just kind of making snap judgment calls on their own. But at a certain point, God in history said, we now need to codify the law. And from this point onwards, I will tell you that even if in your own head, you think that going against Jewish law is going to end up better for the Jews, better for you, better for whatever, starting from Mount Sinai, you're not allowed to make that calculation anymore. You're not allowed to make that decision anymore. Now, I don't know how many more tangents you want to suffer here, but I think there is one more thing that's actually quite relevant when it comes to making calculations and stuff like that, because some people might tend to think, well, hold on a second. Is the Torah absolving me of all responsibility? If it says, listen, just trust me, follow these laws, and then you'll be fine. So I want to give you a really interesting example that highlights just to what extent we take this principle. The Rabbeinu Nissim, who was a medieval commentary, gives a case. He says, what happens if you, Joe, bring your chicken to the rabbi and say, Rabbi, is this chicken kosher? Can I eat it? And the rabbi checks it, looks inside, okay, yeah, fine. Everything's kosher, Joe. Go ahead. You can go home and serve it to your wife and family. Fantastic. Joe goes home, cooks his meal. A day later, the rabbi happens to be brushing up on his laws of kashrut, and he notices, oh no, I gave Joe the wrong answer. That chicken was actually treif. That was not a kosher chicken. Oh, man. Poor rabbi, right? Because the rabbi's got to actually do tshuva. The rabbi actually has to work on himself because he gave a wrong ruling when he should have been more knowledgeable and been more careful about giving a ruling. However, what about Joe? What happens to Joe? Do we say Joe, through no fault of his own, has now committed an egregious sin of eating treif chicken? So Rabbeinu Nissim actually says, because Joe fulfilled the principle of listening to the rabbi who gave him that halachic ruling, that legal ruling to eat the chicken, the fact that he observed that mitzvah, that outweighs any negative consequences that were done as a result of him eating the treif chicken. Now that's incredible, because what that says is that even in an objective sense, where you know for certain that the consequences actually did not turn out well, the consequences were not good, right? If Joe was sitting there kind of equivocating, I don't know, Rabbi, this is a really borderline case of a strange chicken. And the rabbi's like, trust me, trust me, trust me. Okay, I'm trusting you. At that moment, Joe can go home and go and rest easy because he's absolved of any blame. God says, it's okay. You did the right thing. You listened to the rabbi. And even though you ate a non-kosher chicken as a result, it's more important that you follow the rules, even if it means doing something which later ends up coming to light that it was the wrong thing to do. Now that's a mind-blowing example of just how Kantian we become once the Torah has been given.
That's a fantastic example. I think sometimes you could be, understandably, if a person who's morally and ethically sensitive, they're like, I want to make sure I'm doing the right thing. And it could become like, I really don't know what to do here. Like, I really don't know. Like, I heard this, I think I may have brought this up in a previous episode, but it's a really powerful idea that in this book, The Choice to Be, the author, Rabbi Jeremy Kagan, says, God does not need you to take care of poor people. He can take care of poor people by himself. He doesn't need you to do that. But it's our responsibility to acting that way, we're like, the whole point of there being poor people is that it's our responsibility to help them. So we have to do what we need to do, and God will worry about the consequences later. He'll worry about the after effects. He'll worry about the results. Our job is to act properly. And I think that's embedded in your example in terms of that guy had a chicken who I wasn't sure about. He went to ask somebody who was an authority about the subject. He got his answer. And he's like, okay, I'm good to go. I did what I was supposed to do. And it doesn't sound good. I'm absolved of responsibility. But I think the general idea is that, like, I did what I was supposed to do, and the fact that there may have been consequences that were that were not intended or that we didn't see forthcoming, that's just it's not your job to predict the future.
You're right, and it's amazing, and I just think it shows a real nuance when it comes to viewing the Torah's moral stance, which is that we're not beholden to Kant or Mill or any of the 18th century philosophers who've decided to kind of make one box or another box in terms of what do we follow morally. The Torah itself is much more complicated than that. And it ultimately seems like there's two layers here, which is that the base layer of reality is that if you are God, then there's no other way to make a decision of what's more moral than what's ultimately going to produce a better outcome. I don't know how else to phrase it. I don't even know how else to think about it. If you're God, that's the whole point, is to create the most good. But that being said, once, let's say, God has mainstreamed the Torah and given it to not just a few very righteous souls, but rather an entire nation of millions of people, at that point, God says, we're going to make this a lot more, we're going to take some of the calculations out of your hands. And we're going to say that you just have to have the faith, really, that what's written in the Torah, and by observing what's written in the Torah, will produce the best outcome. And I, God, am going to make a promise that that's what's going to happen.
And what's amazing with that is that there is still some wiggle room in terms of the rabbis are allowed to say, like, when it comes to, for example, negotiating hostages. And the truth is, it's kind of funny because I remember, in hindsight, I do not agree that there was the right decision. Not that, no one cares what I think, but when releasing Gilad Shalit for 1,000 terrorists, again, we can just be neutral on the topic. Was this a good idea or a bad idea? Right. I told a friend of mine, like a non-Jewish friend of mine, I was like, yeah, well, look, that just shows how much we value like human life. And he was like, Ophir, that was a stupid decision by the Israeli government. You're literally incentivizing Hamas to take more. He was, he was right. It was
right.
just
Although,
interesting.
Then again, now look, this is just an example of how complicated this kind of, consequentialist thinking is. Like, let's calculate, is this going to actually incentivize? On the other hand, the proponents of the hostage swap, the hostage release for prisoners, was that they said, yes, but now Israeli fighters will fight harder, knowing how far, to what extent the Israeli government will go to get back a captured Israeli soldier. So maybe it's worthwhile to preserve the morale of the Israeli defense forces, even if it means giving up, thousands of terrorists and prisoners and bad people. So, and the answer is like, I don't know what's going to be better or worse. Yes, on the one hand, it seems stupid. On the other hand, maybe they have their reasons, and it's like there's no end to this matter. So it took the people of the rabbis of the Talmud with their giant shoulders to say, we're going to make a final decision that past a certain amount, you cannot ransom people. And by the way, just to make things even more complicated, Tosfos, one of the commentaries on the Talmud over there, says, yes, but there is an exception to the rule. Somebody who is a massively important rabbi we might be able to pay more money for that person as opposed to somebody else. And I do recall that in recent history, I believe there was a rabbi, I think it was Rabbi Yitzchak Hutner, who was taken hostage in one of the hijacked planes by some PLO terrorist going to Israel. And there was a whole back and forth amongst the rabbinic authorities at the time in the 70s, I believe it was, about whether or not they should pay the hostages for Rabbi Hutner, because he was considered to be one of these great rabbis of the generation. And so maybe it's worthwhile to pay the ransom for him. And it was not a simple decision. It was not a simple decision.
If I can ask, what was the decision?
Ophir, you have the world's knowledge at your fingertips. You're going to go ahead and Google it. I apologize. I didn't do enough of my homework because I didn't think we were going to get this far off track onto the question of whether they ended up ransoming Rabbi Hutner. He was freed, by the way. He ended up being freed. Right. But I don't know what the rabbinic decision was about to what extent it would have been permissible to go in order to free him.
Perfect. I have my homework, and hopefully the listeners will also take a quick look. Rabbi Yitzchak Hutner, I think it was actually the Entebbe, but he was not saved in Entebbe. I think he was released earlier. That I do know. I actually heard that once he was released and he came back, I think, to New York, there were people there to greet them, like these Bachram, and they were all dancing and singing. And I heard Rabbi Moshe Feinstein kind of scolded people, and he's like, we're happy that he's released, but there's still a whole bunch of people who are being held hostages, so don't celebrate prematurely, which I thought was a really interesting response. But very okay, true. So getting back to our discussion, I feel like we've spoken about this, and I definitely alluded to it earlier, was that when he said, Thanos has a really interesting line that he says, the hardest choices require the strongest wills. In terms of when it comes to an easy moral decision, right? Like, am I going to take a brick and throw it through a store, jewelry store, because I want to, it's my wife's anniversary, I want to get her something nice? The answer is no. Okay, no. But what if you're, I don't know, again, like there's a hostage situation, there's a crazy gunman who's pointing his gun at somebody's head, and he's like, get me, some jewelry or I'm going to kill them. Then the people are like, okay, like now I have more justification to throw that brick. In terms of when things are easy, it's easy to make that decision. But when things are much more difficult, you require the strongest wills. So I'm kind of wondering, like, do we agree with this? The hardest choices require the strongest wills? Because I'm hearing the answer is like, it's not about your willpower. It's about your clarity. Like, do you know what the right thing to do is? And what makes a hard choice, I guess? Like, what makes a hard choice that would require such a will?
So this goes back to another example of how compelling a villain Thanos is, because he's not wrong. The hardest choices do require the strongest wills. And I have another theory, which again, you're going to have to lay it at my feet because I haven't seen anybody say it outright. But I think that almost every moral decision is more difficult than the immoral opposite. I think almost every good decision, the right decision, is almost always more difficult than the wrong decision in almost every case. Now, in the case of Thanos, you could see that maybe he was conflicted by this. There was something very human about Thanos. The fact that he mourned over the fact that he had to even sacrifice his daughter, right, in order for his quest for the Infinity Stones, and that he didn't take this decision lightly. You saw there was he felt the great moral weight. He still felt like he was doing the right thing, but he felt a real moral weight in deciding whether or not to kill half of all sentient life in the universe. So he's not wrong, and yet I think this principle highlights just how corrupted our modern philosophy and ethics have become. And I'll explain why. I think that a lot of people have and could make the argument for Thanos. I think a lot of people would say, maybe not half, but maybe a third. You can play around with the numbers enough ways, and you can make it compelling for people to say, yeah, maybe it's worthwhile in order to make an omelet, you got to break a few eggshells. And I think the reason why that is because we've been locked in this utilitarian Kantian debate for hundreds of years, if not thousands of years. For a very, very long time, humanity has been discussing what's more important, the deed or the consequences. And the answer is, we don't know. We don't know the answer. We're still fighting about it. Philosophers are still having it out between these two schools of thought. And they both have, their arguments get better every generation. These are some of the most intelligent, like, you ever met philosophy professors? They're not stupid people. And they're still thinking about it. And they're still coming up with arguments and counter arguments and counter arguments. And it will never end. But the reason why is because the concept of philosophy itself rejects any ground rules. There's no a priori, which means, right, before we start arguing, can we agree on some of the rules? Philosophy says everything's up for grabs. Everything's up for debate. We don't have to agree on any first principles. And that's why they'll keep arguing forever. If you just want to say, look, I'm a rationalist. I want to make my decisions based on the most objectively, logically consistent argument. You will be forever confounded about what decision to make. Because there are more than one logically consistent arguments that make sense, and that if you follow them all the way down, you could convince yourself that's absolutely the right thing to do. So how are we as humanity meant to make that decision? And the answer is, we're not. We're not meant to make that decision because we don't have this all-encompassing understanding of the universe, because our minds are limited. We just don't have the capacity to say, I'm going to derive objective truth from first principles. Instead, we have to have something called humility and something called faith, and rely on something that's beyond us and outside of us and much greater than us to be able to say, okay, these are the ground rules. Now, once you have them, you're welcome to debate which ones takes priority, which one's more important, which one's less important. That's the entire corpus of the Talmud, is people debating about what takes precedence and when does this apply and when does it not apply. And that's great. And you can even use some of the philosophical principles that you've learned in your university class and import them over to analyzing the strength of a particular Talmudic argument. But one thing that philosophy itself will never arrive at is a first truth, a first principle, because that's just not what philosophy is for.
That's awesome. And that is a way I have heard the Talmud being described. It's like, I think from Rabbi Tatz, where he says the Talmud is fascinating because it's like this interweaving of the divine in terms of Torah law, what God says is correct and true and the right choice to make, with human ingenuity, because God doesn't speak to every single possible nuanced questions. The answer is God gives us, here are the ground rules. Now go. As long as you're based on the ground rules and you're trying to figure out, like, what would the Torah want me to do? Now it's free. And now, again, it's not open season. You can't just be like, well, I think this, and this is my reasoning. You have to hash out with other people who are also equally well-versed in Torah law to make sure that it stands and that your thinking isn't getting corrupted. But I think that's a really powerful, I think that's an excellent answer. I do have a question about Thanos, and I wonder if this I think makes him a very compelling villain, is that, again, he's not some evil madman who just wants to kill half of the humanity because it'll make him great. He's not interested in that. He's not interested in becoming king of the world. He doesn't want to be a tyrant. So two things. First, he's willing to sacrifice his own daughter, who he loves, for this. So clearly he's convinced of the correctness of the action. And
he's got skin in the game. He's got skin in the game.
Right. It's not like, I'll sacrifice your daughter because I think it's good. He's like, I'm willing to take out my own kid because I think that's the correct thing to do. That's one. And two, we have this principle of that in Judaism, in terms of there is a principle that's been, it's fairly well known, that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. What does Thanos do once he does what he thinks is right with the Infinity Stones? He destroys them. I think that makes him much more compelling as a villain, because he's not using this power now to dominate the universe. He's like, I did what I thought was right. sacrificed for my daughter, and now I gave it up once I achieved my ends. So I am curious, how does the Torah view that? I think that kind of, again, even what he's doing, I guess two questions is, even if what he's doing is wrong, does that mitigate the evil of his actions? Because at least his heart was in it, is in terms of he had good intentions. Do we care about that at all?
Yes, of course we care about intentions. We absolutely do. And I think, I'll just keep saying it again. I think that Thanos is one of the greatest villains, ever to make it to the screen. There's so many nuances to him that you can hate him and sympathize with him at the same time. You can know for sure he's wrong, but also just, he's not a cutout, a two-dimensional being. And this last point that you made is a great one, which is that he doesn't even do it for his own personal gain. He wipes out half of all life in the universe and then retires to some quiet planet where he can just go live out his days and doesn't want the power, anymore. So he's purely ideologically driven. The problem is that doesn't make his actions any better. We might still feel more sympathy for him, but that just goes to prove my point even more, which is that if you've got the wrong ideology, I don't care how much of a nice guy you are. I don't care how much skin in the game you have. I don't care how much you're not in it for the power. You've done tremendous evil. You've done great evil. Now, in terms of can we judge Thanos? I don't know. Like, did Thanos have access to the Torah and divine truth? There isn't much God that's being mentioned in the entire Marvel Cinematic Universe. Every now and then, if there is anything religion-oriented, it's usually denigrated. Not always, but I was saddened to see that there was a small, tiny moment in the new final Fantastic Four movie where perennially in the comic books, it's known that the Thing is Jewish. And there is a scene where the Thing goes to a synagogue, and this woman who he kind of has a thing for, the Thing has a thing for her, says, "Oh, are you here for spiritual guidance?" He's like, "Nah, no, I'm just here to see you." And I thought, oh man, way to cheapen. Because I've had this kind of interest in Judaism in comic books, and in the comics, the Thing is like a proud Jew. He's proudly Jewish, and here it's this throwaway line where he basically throws away his own Judaism. He basically says, "I don't care about Judaism. I just care about love." So it was a wasted moment, I think. But that's the real question: can we judge Thanos? If he was complete, we see he was doing it for pure motives, seemingly, right? We see he was doing it for pure motives. So does that mean that he's off the hook? And typically we say, if a person had access or was capable of arriving at divine truth, then no matter what their pure motives were, they still chose the wrong thing. And if we were to bring Thanos into the real world, I think we would say, and I think there are philosophers such as Maimonides and others who say that the existence of a one God is something that can be logically arrived at by your own mind, by your own reason. And therefore, anybody who doesn't arrive at monotheism will be held accountable for that because they didn't arrive at the right answer, and they should have. So when you talk about the intention of Thanos, I think the real question that you're asking is, can we judge him? Because he did evil. We know he did evil. We know by our standards he did the wrong thing. The question is, should he be judged by our standards or by what he thought was right? And I think we've kind of discussed what the answer to that would be.
Right. Fascinating. Continuing with that. So I think our understanding is that by our standards, what he did was wrong, objectively. One more question is, does that make him almost more terrifying as a villain? In terms of, and you have, and I'll admit, I mean, like, just speaking like law school wise, I found there's torts, right? Where people get into accidents and, they get sued in terms of just like civilly, in terms of when you take them to court and you get money for the damage that they did to you. There are those cases. And then you have criminal law. Interestingly, except for one case, which was horrific and I've never spoken to anybody about because the circumstances were awful, I generally found criminal law cases were actually, they were sad in terms of people getting murdered but like there are evil people in the world, right? There are evil people in the world. What they did was wrong. Everyone knows it's wrong. You're reading this criminal case and you're like, it's horrible. And like, this should not have been done. Torts, I found the torts cases were much harder to read because you said people just made an accident. It was an accident. Like there were two, I think 25-year-old stewardesses, like flight attendants. And one of them, like they were on their way to work, a truck crashed into their car, and one of them became a paraplegic. It was this young girl, like kind of snuffed out, 25 years old, and she was a paraplegic or quadriplegic. She was out, and she won the case, but it's not enough to pay for her bills, and it certainly doesn't make her whole. It's like heartrending. You read these cases that are horrible. So I'm just wondering, Thanos, is he more terrifying because he thinks he's right? Like, I'd almost ask me what you prefer as a villain. Like, he's more sympathetic, but he's scarier because he really thinks what he's right. If you're like, choose your villain. Like, he's evil and he knows he's evil and he's just doing the evil thing. You're like, okay, you're just like, you don't scare me as much because you're just like an evil guy. But it's more like, how does Judaism approach this? Sorry, I guess to phrase my question, does it make Thanos more terrifying, the fact that he did the wrong thing and he had correct intentions? What is the Jewish perspective on this? Like, how do we view him? Should we be more worried about such an individual, or are we more worried about people who do the wrong thing for bad reasons?
It's a good question. My initial reaction would be that people who do bad things because they're jealous, because they're greedy, because they're power hungry, are less terrifying to me. And the reason why is because their jealousy or their greed or their lust for power is actually a blind spot for them. It's a weakness. They will make mistakes as a result of their greed. They will do things that harm their ultimate cause, or they can be easily exploited if you simply know a very one-dimensional motivation for why they're doing what they're doing. Somebody who is ideologically driven and is not in it for the money. What comes to mind actually is Christopher Nolan's The Joker is another excellent example of this. He steals money and then burns it. He has no interest in monetary gain, right? What's he trying to do? He's basically just a nihilist. He's just there to just ruin society. And even if it costs him his own life, that's really scary. That's really scary because what weaknesses are you going to exploit? He's not doing it for himself. Not really, maybe yes, maybe no, like his own psychological makeup. So absolutely.
If I can actually share, I think that's a perfect example, because I think that's what makes Thanos so scary in terms of it's like, that it's like the ultimate moment, Thor throws his hammer, Thanos is like blasting with like all 6 Infinity Stones, and Thor aimed true, struck his chest. And then Thanos is like, you should have gone for the head. And like that idea is like, if he was in it for himself, then he maybe would have been like, oh, what's the point now? Like, I'm going to die. The whole point is for me to be a ruler of the universe. And he's like, it's not the point. I'm in this for real, even if I die. And he snaps his fingers. I see what you mean in terms of that's kind of similar to the Joker. Like, he doesn't care if he dies. He's willing to take his cause all the way to the end. That is terrifying.
Yeah. Now, on the flip side of this, I can only think of one example in history where there was a leader who was actually willing to give up his power and who didn't succumb to absolute power corrupts absolutely. And it's such a great example, which is the example of George Washington. So after Washington served 2 terms as the first president, there was a not not tiny percentage of the new country that actually wanted him to become the king. They felt that the only way to really have a strong country would be to have a monarchy. And they wanted George Washington to become president for life. And George Washington basically said, I didn't fight this hard against the British monarchy to now establish another monarchy. This is going to be a democracy, a representative government. And he stepped down. It's quite amazing. A lot of the stories about him chopping down cherry trees and whatever are probably myths, but this one is actually true. And it's so rare in history to see somebody who has power that once they're done, they relinquish power because they know that it's better for the society that somebody should not be having that much power. And it happens all the time. It happens all the time. So we should treasure these, few examples of people who are willing to say, my time is come and gone. It's not about me. It's about something greater than me. And if, in some weird way, we can derive inspiration from Thanos and say, despite the horrific atrocities that he committed in that movie, there was something admirable about him. And I think as Jews, we are permitted to point out the compliments and the positives of even our greatest enemies. That there's a medrash that talks about the good qualities of Achashverosh, despite the fact that he was willing to genocide the Jews. Nonetheless, there were certain things that the Midrash says he did well. So in the same way that we are okay with finding the flaws of our heroes, we're okay to find the virtues of our villains. And I think we can maybe afford the same thing to Thanos.
That's great. And I like that ending on a positive note. Rabbi, thank you again for taking the time to work through these dilemmas and to explain in such a clear manner what the Jewish response would be.
Such a blast, Ophir.
Cool. Thank you. Thank you for tuning in to the Dilemmas on Screen, a Jewish Perspective podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe. If you have any suggestions for a moral dilemma you'd like analyzed, feel free to send it over. Thanks again, and see you next time.